My family has had a cottage at Lake St. Peter. Not sure if you know where that is, kind of halfway between Whitney and Maynooth, north of Bancroft. So they would drive from Minden, and it's still, my mother still has the cottage. So you would drive from Minden to the cottage. They had this spot along the way that it was kind of halfway between Tory Hill and Cardiff, I would say, kind of in the bush out there. There's a little lane that goes off to the side that we recognized as the spot that my parents said was halfway to the cottage. So I don't know how it started, but my brother and I, who's coming from Germany this very day, again, as we would drive past that spot on the road, we would kind of vie to simultaneously, although simultaneously meant the other, you had to beat the other one out by just a little bit. We would say halfway mark. I'd just come up to him, halfway mark, so, except it was, we didn't, our voices hadn't changed, so it was halfway mark, whatever. And so that was a thing, that we did I don't know if that's weird, eh? yeah, that's weird. So I guess most people's families didn't do stuff like that. Anyway, things like that, it's kind of marking the journey, breaking it up. I wasn't here last week, but so the week before, I didn't get a chance to talk about Groundhog Day with y'all. But Groundhog Day, pretty sure he was wrong, whatever he said. Wyatt and Willie. Apparently he's only right 37% of the time. But, so whatever the case. So I was looking into the background to Groundhog Day. And apparently at one time, it was kind of once again, a church festival or feast day, kind of in there to mark halfway through winter, halfway between the winter solstice, or roughly December 21st, and the spring equinox, March the 21st. So, Groundhog Day, halfway mark. So we're well beyond halfway mark now, you can see, so we're, the toughest parts are over. The Transfiguration, which is what today, we didn't put it up on the board, but this is Transfiguration Sunday, it's in your bulletins. And this story or account of this experience with Jesus up on the mountaintop is called the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is the halfway mark of Mark. So we're halfway through the Gospel of Mark, roughly. So especially in terms of the way the story unfolds. So Mark does not tell the story of Jesus' birth at all. He doesn't go into that. Matthew and Luke do. So Mark starts with John the Baptist and his ministry, and Jesus goes to get baptized and goes right through to the resurrection. And so there's 16 chapters in the Gospel of Mark. So this is the beginning of chapter 9. So it's even halfway in the text. But most significantly, I suppose, it's halfway in that up to this point. So up to through chapter 8, Jesus is doing all this kind of cool ministry stuff. He's mostly in Galilee, which is his kind of home province, north of Judea. So there's Judea, then to the north is Samaria, where the Samaritans live, and then north of that, Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. And so that's where most of his stuff is happening. So he's healing people, he's teaching people, he's raising the dead, he's casting out the demons, he's doing miracles, feeding the thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish. All that kind of stuff is happening in this space. He does venture out. He ventures across the lake to Gentile country, and he ventures into the north to Gentile country. But by and large, that's kind of his area. Once you hit the story of the Transfiguration, the theme kind of changes. The story shifts, and he starts to head towards Jerusalem. He heads towards what we call the Passion, where he will be crucified. So he's on his way. Even in the next chapter, it says he's on his way to Jerusalem, and his disciples are astonished. They're like, what does he think he's doing? Because they can see what's going to happen. So this is the halfway mark. So it's been a traditional thing to have Transfiguration Sunday on the last Sunday before Lent, because Lent is the season where we kind of prepare for Easter. We kind of think toward the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. So this kind of fittingly is the theme for the last Sunday before. Now, back to the languages again, with fear and trembling. The Greek. In the Greek where it says, and he was transfigured before them, the Greek word is metamorphe, from which we get the word metamorphosis, which means this grand change. We usually use it for this grand change in the life of an insect when it moves from, when it goes through its cycle and goes from its egg to its pupa to its cocoon and then to its full-fledged adult, like the beautiful butterfly. That's metamorphosis. I thought that was a cool word. Why don't we use that instead of transfiguration? Metamorphosis, so much cooler, but I'm probably not going to get my way. So anyway, the metamorphosis of Jesus, or the transfiguration of Jesus, the story has got all these surprising, kind of shocking things in it, really. So you have to stop and think, whoa, what's going on here? I mean, most of the time when Jesus is walking and talking, he does do miracles and stuff. But this time, he's way up on this mountain with 3 of the disciples, and he turns white. They have, Mark and the other gospelers are having trouble describing this. They don't know how to put it into words. So they say, he looked whiter than snow, whiter than any bleach could bleach him, which is kind of awkward. But, it was just their way of saying, we don't know what happened. He's just kind of shone like the sun in front of us. Now, only 3 of the disciples got to see this: Peter, James, and John. You may recall, a few weeks ago, we had a sermon called Gone Fishing. We talked about the 4 original disciples who were fishermen, and Andrew, Peter, James, and John, and kind of what happened to them, how their discipleship unfolded, and how they became fishers of men. But 3 of those guys, Peter, James, and John, were the inner circle. So Jesus had picked 12 to be with him, kind of close into him, but beyond that, he had 3 that were kind of the inner core group, which may seem kind of strange to us. Why was Jesus showing such preferential treatment? And I've thought about that a fair bit, but I think partly was because these guys were leadership material. I mean, they were raw leadership material. When you read the gospel accounts of John and James, who are brothers, they're brothers, the sons of Zebedee, Jesus nicknames them the sons of thunder, because they're always thinking, well, a couple of instances. One is they come to Jesus and they say, Master, we'd like you to put us one at your right hand and one at your left when you come into your kingdom. So when you get to be the highest of all, we want to be right there, one on either side of you, like number 2 and number 3. And it says the other disciples were getting a little upset with them about this. But that was the kind of guys they were. So Jesus calls them the sons of thunder. Another time, they say to Jesus, there's these guys doing stuff over here. They're casting out demons or something. I forget what they were doing exactly, but that they didn't think was right because they weren't actually following Jesus like they were. They said, do you want us to call down lightning and thunder from heaven on top of them, Lord? And Jesus says, no. Like, they don't really get, he says, they're not really get where I'm coming from. But that was what they were like. So they were eager to be kind of in charge and had great ambition and all that sort of thing. And Peter, of course, was similar in the sense that he was always first one up. What does this mean? Well, I think it's this. So he's very spontaneous and impetuous and that kind of thing. So he was leadership material too. The thing about it is, although they were the ones who were the closest to Jesus, Jesus says a couple of things about that. He says, to whom much is given, much is required. So great things would be required of these guys, to whom much was given. And he also says, whoever would be greatest among you must be the least of all and the servant of all. And that's exactly what turns out with him. So they don't get to be those great famous people, acclaimed by all. They get to be the servants of everybody, despised by many, persecuted. And so as the church kind of begins, you go through the book of Acts, Peter and John are sticking their neck way out. They're the first preachers of the gospel. It says they're going around preaching at one place or another, and they start to be persecuted and thrown in prison and all this kind of stuff. James, the brother of John, is the first of the apostles to be killed for his faith. So he's the first, not the first martyr, but the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. So yeah, they paid a price for being on the inside, but they were on the inside. So that was one thing. So this strange kind of glowing that they got to see of Jesus on the hill, on the mountain. The other thing was, there's 2 guys show up with him, Moses and Elijah. And you got to think, oh, hold on, I thought those guys were dead. Yeah, by 1,000 years or so in the case of Moses and hundreds of years in the case of Elijah. So Jesus is walking around with dead guys. Well, that's arguable because Elijah really didn't die. He got whipped up in the chariot. Remember? I looked over Jordan and what did I see? Chariot coming forward to carry me home. So he did go up in the chariot according to Scripture. And so, but the point is they're both kind of with the Lord. They're in heaven. So Jesus is showing, it's really a teaching that we don't just cease to exist. That we carry on. Our life carries on with God. So it's a teaching about heaven, about paradise, just in this encounter. So how they knew it was Moses and Elijah were not explained. I was at seminary. There was a whole lot of thinking about how that could have been. And nobody knows, but they knew. So Moses and Elijah are there with Jesus. Now that's very significant, of course. These particular two men in particular. They represent to the Jew of Jesus' day the richness of their spiritual heritage, if you will. So what we call the Old Testament, these are two of the main characters. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. Moses, the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which are called the law or the Torah, and are the basis of the entire Jewish faith. And then the prophets later on came along to call the people back to the law and say, hey, you guys, this is what the deal was. Your covenant with God is about this, and you have failed. So God's going to bring some judgment on you unless you change your ways, and so on. So the main thrust of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, what we call the Hebrew Scriptures, was the law and the prophets, and they are well represented by Moses and Elijah. Also, those guys had mountaintop experiences. Moses got the law up on Mount Sinai with all kinds of strange things happening, thunder and lightning and volcanoes and that kind of stuff. And Elijah, if you recall the story of Elijah, how he ran all the way to Mount Sinai from Israel, and he's up on the mountain, and there's like an earthquake, and there's a fire, and there's the rocks are split open, and it says God wasn't in that. And then there was a sound of a still small voice, and God was in the still small voice. That was up on the mountain. That was Elijah. So Jesus is actually in that tradition now. Is what an early reader of the gospel would understand immediately. So a Jewish early reader of this gospel or hearer of this story would understand that what is being told to us, what is being presented to us, is that Jesus is in line with the greats. There's Moses, Elijah, and now Jesus also is up on the mountaintop, and weird things are happening. Weird and wonderful things are happening. But also, he is greater than those guys, because he's the one that's glowing and shining like the sun. Okay, so that's quite a message. So that's and the third thing that's happening up there is it says a cloud overshadows them, and there's a voice comes from the cloud. So they hear the voice of God coming out of the cloud, and it says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Listen to him. Now, I can't remember whether I'm going there a little bit later. Yeah. So just to remember that listen. No, I'm going to tell you about that in a little bit. So you got to hang in. Are you guys too hot, or are you okay? Just right? I'm cooking, which is kind of nice. Sure. 25. It's like minus 25 out, plus 25 in. Okay. So what was this all about? What was this grand viewing or vision or experience that these disciples had, and Jesus transfigured before them, and all these signs? Good question. In seminary, I went to a seminary which was very kind of liberal and critical, skeptical about these things. So I mean, they would find meaning in this kind of thing, but they wouldn't necessarily believe that this was an actual historical event. They would say they would think that this was a concoction of the early church who were attempting to kind of boost the myth or the legend of Jesus, and so they were making up stories to make it more impressive who he was. I don't think so. But that's another argument for another day. But that's kind of the way people think. It was funny. We had one child in all 3 churches today. One little child came to Inglesby. Her name's Maisie. Some of you know Maisie. And so Maisie says whatever's on her mind. And you talk about unless you become like a little child, you cannot see the kingdom of heaven. There it was, right in front of me. So she hadn't really listened to the reading earlier on because, that's hard to do, and especially when you're a child, you're looking around and all kinds of stuff. So I kind of explained it to her. I said, well, Jesus went up in the mountain, and he kind of just started to glow and shine like the sun. And she says, "Do you really think that happened?" It was hilarious. And what a great point. I think really, when we get adult, we can't even ask that. Well, yeah, you can ask that. Do you really think it happened? Think about it. And you don't have to believe it happened, but I do. But basically, our whole faith is built on wild supernatural things that have happened, like, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So if the resurrection of Jesus from the dead happened, all this is like small potatoes. So it's not that big a deal, not that hard to believe. Once you buy into that, and I do, so I don't have a problem with it. So what was going on here? A couple things, lots of things, but we're just going to dabble into it a bit today. I think it happened partly for Jesus' own benefit. I think it happened partly for Jesus' own benefit. Now, when you get to reading the Lenten letter, which is coming out this week, I talk about Jesus fasting. Remember the 40-day fast, and how that was for his benefit, actually. And at the end of the fast, actually, it says angels minister to him. After his temptations, the angels minister to him. We have to remember, even though many of us believe in the divinity of Christ, that this is God come in the flesh. And so this is a God-man. But the point is, he's also a man. He is entirely, fully, completely human, with the frailty and the challenge that it is to be a human in our world. So he had those things to deal with just the same as we do. And so we find that if you go through the Gospels, you find he gets these moments when he's encouraged by God, when he's given experiences of the presence of God to carry him along on the tough path that he's going to have to walk. So right at the end of the temptations, we find that. I think here we find it too, and that makes sense. So basically what's happening here is he's having a mountaintop experience. In fact, I think that's where the expression probably comes from, because a lot of our kind of expressions like that are out of the Bible at some point. So Jesus had a mountaintop experience, and it's a high. He had a tremendous spiritual high where he reconnected with the Father. He's walking around in paradise, basically. He's seeing people that are long gone. And he's hearing voice, there's the audible voice of God. And he's given the opportunity to actually show who he really is to some of his disciples. So I think this was a huge boost for him, just as he was about to head in the direction of Jerusalem. Now, he had a hard road to climb there, a hard road to hoe, I guess they say. He was about to head towards Jerusalem, where he would be attacked and confronted by many enemies. He would be challenged every which way but loose, So he would be abandoned by all his friends. He would be put through a mock trial. He would be condemned to death. He would be tortured. He would be crucified, and he would be killed. And he knew it. He's starting to tell. If you go through the Gospels, he's already telling his disciples, "This is what's going to happen to me," and they can't. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. But that was the road, the path he had agreed and he was willing to travel on. And so therefore, this was actually a wonderful strengthening for him just before he kind of embarked on that. It's also true for us. I find it's wondrously true in my own life. God gives us experiences of him, of himself. That's kind of what Christianity, they call it Christianity, but the Christian faith is actually about the encounter with God through Jesus Christ. It's through Jesus because Jesus deals with our fallenness, our brokenness, our sinfulness. And so we have to have that forgiveness to kind of get in the door. But that's an experiential thing, to understand that you're completely forgiven and that you're accepted and that you're one of God's children and you're beloved through Christ. That's meant to be not just something up here that they say this in church, or it says this in the Bible. It's something that God slams home to our hearts, and it's an experience, and it's life transforming. So those kinds of experiences are to get us through, if you will. Sometimes they're just experiences of clarity, where it just all makes sense. Oh, of course, it's so simple. It's so simple. Sometimes it seems real complicated, but sometimes it seems real simple. Or sometimes it's just kind of an experience of assurance. Assurance. I know God's watching over me, and I know where I'm going even if I die. And, I'm got a calm about that. Or kind of in line with that, peace, strange peace. Jesus calls it the peace that passes understanding. Ever had that? Just a peace that, you're in the midst of a storm, you're in the midst of all kinds of anxiety-provoking things, and yet you're at peace. That's really a kind of mountaintop thing. It's an experience. Paul talks about we do not walk by we walk by faith, not by sight. He says we walk by faith and not by sight. So that's really what we're called to do, is live a life that we live. We can't see God, we can't see the spiritual realm with our five senses, but we believe it, we trust in it, we trust in the Lord. So we live that way. But sometimes it almost is sight. It's so obvious, it's so clear, it's so of course that it's almost sight. But those times are actually a little bit rare. So they're not constant, but they're given in order to tide us through the rest of the time. Does that make sense to you? And I think that we're meant to have them. That's the normal Christian life. That you and I are meant to have an experience of the living power of the living God in those kinds of ways and many other ways besides. So, for instance, the story of John Wesley. John Wesley was an 18th century preacher you may have heard about, brother of Charles Wesley, who wrote that hymn we just sang. So the Wesley brothers, well, John was the older and kind of the leader, and he'd felt the call to ministry in the Anglican Church in his day in England. So he became ordained in England, and then at some point he even went to the colonies to preach to America. So he preached in America, and he just really didn't get off the ground. He really didn't have much power and much conviction. Nobody was really too interested in what he had to say, so he kind of was discouraged, and he kind of goes back to England. And as the story goes, one day he's in England, and he goes to this evening meeting at a little kind of house church, or I don't even quite remember what it was, but it was a very small gathering of Moravian Christians. And the speaker, the teacher that day, was teaching about from Paul's letters. I think it was from Romans, about just explaining that we are justified by faith. It's not by works. It's not by what we do. It's not by that we're special, but that God, by His grace, just if we put our trust in Christ, God wipes the slate clean, puts the life of His Son within us, and calls us His kids, His children. He makes us His own, justified by faith. And anyway, so that was the gist of the message. And so Wesley wrote later, he says, "My heart was strangely warmed." Have you ever heard about that? My heart was strangely warmed. Wasn't a big mountaintop thing, but his heart was strangely warmed. And he's totally changed. So he starts to go out and preach with a powerful effect. Hundreds of people become Christians. This guy has the guts to go and preach at mines and in factories in a day when England is in the toilet, really. I mean, it's in rough shape. I mean, there's horrible excesses of alcoholism and poverty and child slavery, and all this stuff's going on. And it starts to change through the preaching of Wesley and some others. Society actually begins to be transformed. That's the start of what you've heard of Methodism. They were the first Methodists, which, as you may know, the Methodist Church is the main ingredient of the United Church of Canada back in 1925. So a little history there, but it all goes back to an experience that he had in this little church or whatever it was, where he heard, his heart was strangely warmed. I've had those too. I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't talk to you, I wouldn't get up and preach if I hadn't. I think sometimes people think, he somewhere in high school they chose preaching and to be a minister as a career path. Yeah, right. Not me. I had no inclination for that at all until I encountered Jesus. So encountering Jesus changed me, and it was like, wow, this is really where it's at. This is what it's all about. I got to tell other people about it. How might I best do that? And sort of came in this direction. But I have to have. I kind of need ongoingly the experience of God and the presence of Christ to get up week after week and keep going at it. I think we all do. In order to be followers of Christ. What about you? Did you ever think about that? Has this ever been the case for you? Because it's normative that at some point we actually experience God. Paul talks about this, being transformed. Now the Lord is the Spirit. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So that's an experience thing. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. We experience liberty when the Spirit of God is at work in our lives. And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness from glory to glory. So as we have the experience of actually seeing Jesus, like these apostles saw him on the mountain, we get to be changed to be like him. And that's where Charles Wesley got the line in the hymn, changed from glory into glory, till in heaven we take our place, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise, right? So change from glory into glory. That is the normative Christian experience. But the changing, the transformation comes as we watch Jesus the way these disciples did on the mountain. And basically, the more we see of Jesus, the more like him we become. The more we see of Jesus, the more like him we become. In other words, the more I get, and I'm going to use, I don't know how to say, see, listen. So when the voice comes in the cloud, by the way, and says, this is my beloved son, listen to him, he didn't just mean listen to him. He means listen to him, kind of digest what he's saying, take it to heart, and then do it. It's sort of like some people will say, I should have listened to my mom when I was a teenager. You ever heard people say that? Should have listened to my mom. Now, did they mean I should have just listened to what she had to say? Or did they mean I should have listened, I should have taken it to heart, and I should have done it? Pretty sure that's what they mean. And that's what this means here. To listen to Jesus is not just to say, he said this and that and this and that. It's to listen to it, take it to heart, and do it. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves, says James. But I like the word to get. The more I get that Jesus lived a life completely trusting in his Father, the more I get that it's just like, wow, I know that's the way it is. The more I start to be more like that. I become someone who lives my life trusting in God or trusting in Jesus, because I get that that's the way he lived. The more I get that Jesus was terribly concerned with everybody else around him. He was just full of compassion all the time. He cared way more about everybody else than his own well-being. And the more I get that he was like that, the more I become like that. The more we become like that. The more we care about people around us. We have compassion for those who are in need, because we're seeing Jesus and we're becoming like him. The more we get that he was a man of prayer, he prayed all the time, at every corner, at every turn, the more we become people of prayer. The more we get that Jesus was humble and meek and lowly of heart. He says he was. And the proof's there in all his life. The more we understand that, it just really grabs me so much how humble Jesus is and was. The more we become like that, the more humble we get. It's the secret of how it works in growing as a Christian. The more you see Jesus, kind of gaze at him, the more you become like him. So 2 lessons for Transfiguration Sunday. 1, our faith is experiential. It's fueled by real encounters with the living God. And 2, let's listen to Jesus. Let's look to Jesus, discover Jesus, obey Jesus, and we will begin to glow and to shine and become like him. Shall we pray?